slide is going to be the principles of interpersonal communication. IPC stands for interpersonal communication. And these are on your note-taking guide on the back side. If you're going along to fill that out, you could certainly write them down now. The first one is interpersonal communication is transactional. I just explained to you what that means. And that means it's a transaction where both parties, the speaker and the listener, they're engaged, and it's a transaction. I'm giving you something, you're taking something. Then I'm taking something as you're giving something. So it's a transaction. It's an ongoing thing that both parties are fully involved in. The next principle is interpersonal communication is purposeful. And you'll find in your textbook the discussion of the variety of reasons or purposes that we have to communicate. The first purpose is we communicate to learn. You may ask a question, and the reason why you're asking that question is you want to learn. So you're communicating to me with your purpose of learning. We may communicate because we want to relate to somebody. So I may ask my son, how was your day at school? And that communication is designed to relate to him. The next purpose is influence. I may communicate with my boss and try to influence them to give me more classes, or maybe to change a textbook, or maybe increase or decrease enrollment. I will also have a purpose at times where my communication is designed to play. So my husband and I may joke around about something that happened with maybe a coworker, and we're just playing around, having a good time, laughing, and trying to enjoy one another. And finally, the last purpose that we typically see is to help. When we want to help somebody else, typically we'll give them advice. Other times we may explain something to them. My son came to me this morning and said, I have a math test and I don't understand how I find the percentage of a number that's greater than 100. And so I explained it back to him. Well, that communication that I was using was to help him. His communication to me was to learn. My communication to him was to help. If I also tell my son maybe something about why it's important to eat his fruits and vegetables, that may be communication designed to help him. Even if he doesn't ask me a question about learning, as most of you know that have parents, parents love to communicate to help even when you haven't asked for it. So that can be frustrating, but it's the nature of the parent-child relationship. The next principle is inevitable. Communication cannot be avoided. If you lock yourself in your room for the day, you might avoid communicating with anybody. But my guess is your interpersonal communication is shut down, but your intrapersonal communication, or communication with oneself, communication with yourself in this instance, is still communication. You also cannot stay in your locked room, nor would you want to. Some of you may say, well, it would be fine with me. Well, I don't believe that for a second. I think after 3, 4, 5 days, you would crave human interaction. In fact, it's been proven that people who do not interact with people on a regular basis have been known to go crazy. If you look at the idea of solitary confinement in a prison, the entire purpose there is to cut somebody off from the world, because it does have some psychological, I guess, I want to say benefits, but it's not the right word. It has some psychological repercussions for us. If we can't communicate, we can't stay sane. It's just the nature of who we are. We were made to communicate. Interpersonal communication is irreversible. That's our next principle, and that means you can't take back what you say. When you're growing up, and even probably now, you say, I take it back, I take it back. Unfortunately, interpersonal communication cannot be taken back. Once it's out there, the message has been received, and you can't undo it. It's something that we should all keep in mind when communicating. Another principle, principle number 6, or if you're on your note-taking guide, it would be a letter, and I'm trying to now find that letter, which is taking me longer than I'd like, but anyways, letter F on your note-taking guide. Again, you don't have to do the note-taking guides. They're simply for you to keep everything together. And some people, they find it difficult to just memorize things or remember what somebody said without writing them down. So the note-taking guide's there to help you. Just another way to learn the information. The 6-1, unrepeatable, means that if me and my best friend and I go to the movies and we have a great night, we go out to dinner afterwards and we just laugh and have such a great time, and then the next week we do the same thing and for some reason we just don't have as good of a time. Well, that's because interpersonal communication is unrepeatable. You can't always have the same exact communication or the same exact interaction. It doesn't work that way. And the changing nature of interpersonal communication means sometimes we're going to have a good time and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're going to be effective, sometimes we're not. And that's just how it is. We shouldn't be expecting the same type of communication to repeat itself because it's unrepeatable. And when we expect the same type of communication from people, we find ourselves in some real difficult situations. Principle G, relationships are symmetrical or complementary, or number 7 if you're not doing your note-taking guide. Relationships that are symmetrical means that the people within the relationships are identical. So the way that they behave are very similar. So these are people with similar personalities, similar attitudes, beliefs, and values, and the way that they're communicating and interacting are very much the same. A relationship that's complementary means I have some strengths and I have some weaknesses, and my weaknesses are your strengths and my strengths are your weaknesses. So we kind of fill in the gaps for the other person. We may have some differences, but those differences complement each other. The next principle is that interpersonal communication refers to both the content of a message and the relationship in which we're involved. So, if I tell my husband, Friday night, I'm going to go out with some folks from work, that tells him the message that I'm going to go out with some folks from work next Friday. But what it also says is something about our relationship. Now, I don't want to say that everybody should attach a negative meaning to that message, but for example, relationally, that may say, I need some time away. That may say, I'd like to spend some time with other people. That may say, I don't value you. That may say, I've seen enough of you this week. There's a lot of things that we will attach to a message that has meaning for what's the status of our relationship. We probably shouldn't do that, but nonetheless we do. And I think that's another difficult aspect of communication, is that the content is what it is. And we sometimes get very frustrated with somebody when they say, oh, well, does that mean you don't want to spend time with me that Friday night? Well, that's a response to the relationship aspect, not the other aspect. So just keep in mind, whenever you send a message, it does have a content aspect to it, but it also has a relational aspect to it. So when we communicate, we are saying something about our relationship in addition. So when people say, does that mean this? They're just asking for clarification, and it wouldn't be wise or beneficial to our relationship to get defensive for that, from being asked that question. The last principle we're going to talk about is that interpersonal communication is a series of punctuated events. And every semester, for some reason, students choose not to look at this PowerPoint. They choose not to read their textbook. And what I get for journal entry number 1 is a discussion about punctuation in sentences, periods, commas, exclamation points. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about in interpersonal communication here. For example, when communication is a series of punctuated events, and the next slide actually shows what it is, so I'm going to go ahead and go to that next slide so I can explain it so you can see it at the same time I'm explaining it. So punctuation is basically means where something begins and ends. So it does share that with the period and the comma. That's telling us where a thought ends. Well, this is the same kind of thing, but it doesn't involve any periods or commas. So, for example, in figure A, we see a sequence of events. There's somebody phoning somebody, somebody flirting with somebody, excuse me. And so what it is, there's no beginning or end. Nobody started this interaction. We just know that these two things are going on. One person in the relationship is phoning, one person in the relationship is flirting. B shows the same exact interaction, but somebody claims that the person who was flirting is the one that started it. The reason why the person got on the phone was because somebody was flirting first, and so they would not have gotten on the phone if that person hadn't started flirting. And then the last sequence, or C, shows the person who was on the phone started it, and the flirting didn't begin until that person got on the phone. So